Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Pentagon admits it has no idea who's on drug boats being bombed, posted by from NewRepublic.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross-post from the Anime Titties subreddit, which is more of just the World News subreddit, but, the World News subreddit got so, over moderated, so they made their own one. I'd call it Anime Titties, I guess, but yeah. Personally, I don't really care that, the Pentagon's just bombing drug boats without any due process, but ultimately, the Pentagon and the U.S. military as a whole, just like any other branch of the U.S. government, can justify doing whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's no means to hold them accountable. I guess you could say voting, but even voting, I'm sure, they're just gonna, the other branch of the Unity Party would probably justify doing this as well. The U.S. has countlessly bombed and drone striked the Middle East for decades, and no one even barely even notices anymore. So now they're doing it in Venezuela, and so in that sense, it's a bit closer home. I guess people are noticing, but eventually, they just keep doing it, and people are just gonna, stop, just gonna shrug it off because, it's sad, but, ultimately, it's the American empire can justify doing whatever it wants to, and oftentimes the peasants can do nothing about it, and this is very much an example of that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, in the 2024 presidential election, why did you vote for Donald Trump and not Kamala Harris? Posted from Alex Freeman Art. And they said, for what reason do you genuinely feel you had to vote for Trump over Kamala? Specifically, which points from the Democratic Party convinced you that you had to vote for Trump and not for the Blue Party? Where you voted for Trump, what were you expecting and wanting from him that you knew the Democratic Party would not give you? I won't criticize you, I won't judge you, and I won't argue with you. I generally want to understand and learn the central and specific points and reasons why the American citizen felt the need to vote for Trump and the Republican Party over the Democratic Party. And yeah, personally, I don't think there's too many people on the subreddit that voted for Trump over Kamala. I think a lot of people either voted for Kamala or Chase Oliver, but I personally voted for Chase Oliver because I think Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are two sides of the same coin. Donald Trump might be a bit more of a spaz, and but other than that, they're pretty much going to justify the same stuff. And the president these days is mostly just a figurehead, like the King of the United Kingdom, rather than where the actual power is. The actual power lies with the deep state, such as the military-industrial complex, alphabet agencies like FBI, CIA, NSA, and special interest lobbyist groups like IPAC and big business. I can see an argument that Donald Trump is lesser of two evils, but he's just gonna let the deep state continue on doing whatever it wants to. He might say, "Oh, this term I went after and prosecuted neocon warmonger John Bolton instead of hiring him," but he did bomb Iran this term, which is exactly what neocon warmongers like Bolton want. And that's important to remember as well. Trump might market himself as this populist outsider, but he'll almost always do whatever the regime wants him to do. And I think that's important to remember as well. Next we have Neither God Nor Master, The History of Global Anarchism political documentary posted by Narco Federation. That's from YouTube. That's a YouTube video from Worldview History, Fighting Power, The Story of Anarchists Worldwide, political documentary. And they added, Neither God Nor Master looks back at the major events in the social history of the last 2 centuries and reveals the origins and destiny of the political movement that has been fighting against all masters and gods for over 150 years. And yeah, personally, I sympathize with a lot of anarchy, but, ultimately, I think voluntary collectivism is probably better than just anarchism, I think people should form collectives rather just let everyone run amok and do whatever they want to. That might lead to mass lawlessness, and that's not something I personally care for. But ultimately, I think each person, if they want to do anarchy, I think they should be able to. I think the libertarian position is if each person should do whatever system they want to. If people want to do anarchy, they should be able to. If they want to do communism, they should be able to. If they want to do socialism, they should be able to. If they want to do fascism, they should be able to. As long as they are doing the ideology only with consenting individuals and not non-consenting individuals. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Mehdi Hassan at the No Kings rally. Let me say to every Republican and conservative watching, aren't you the ones that said no more big government, no tyranny America? If you believe that, what are you doing defending masked federal agents in unmarked cars, bundling people off the streets, posted by Helpful Feeding, and that's cross-post from the FOMOS subreddit. I guess that's a clip of Mehdi Hassan saying that, personally I don't care for Mehdi Hassan. He's just another MSNBC blowhard. I don't know if he's still with them, but I know he was with them for a while. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for, the mass federal agents taking people off the streets. But, ultimately, ICE has always been around, but Reddit wasn't on the front page of Reddit. Barack Obama's 2 terms, he set deportation records, but it wasn't on the front page of Reddit, so Reddit didn't care. But now that the outgroup's in power rather than the in-group, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Reddit only cares what people, especially on Reddit and social media in general, pretty much everyone though, they only care whatever the narrative is, and the narrative for a lot of people just is in-group good, out-group bad. And it just goes to show you that, a lot of people don't have principles other than, my side good, your side bad. I'm sure if there were, if there were mass federal agents kidnapping Trump voters and taking them to re-education camps, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. But since they're going after illegal immigrants, which are an in-group category rather than an out-group category, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Libertarians seek partnership with Elon Musk from Politico.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross-post from the Fakertarian subreddit. I like Elon Musk, but personally, I guess we could have a partnership, I do think he's probably been one of the most libertarian parts of the Trump administration, him founding the Department of Government Efficiency and all that. Of course, Reddit, they used to love Elon Musk, but then he joined the political outgroup, and suddenly he was the worst thing ever, and that just goes to show you, people will love you when you're in the in-group, but the second you start going against what the in-group narratives, they suddenly think you're literally worse than Hitler, and they'll say, oh, he did a Nazi salute, even though you can see a lot of Democrat politicians making the exact same gesture, but it's only a Nazi salute when Elon does it. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for if you want to say it was an intentional salute or not, personally, I don't really care, The thing is, though, the Reddit would never call out a Democratic politician if they did that, but since Elon's a member of the out-group rather than the in-group, Reddit has to think he's the worst thing ever. And that's very much how Reddit works. Next we have FBI arrests 14 current former law enforcement officials in drug trafficking takedown from ActionNews5.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, that just goes to show you that, law enforcement is going to be inherently corrupt, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, It's like who watches the Watchmen. In this case, the FBI is arresting former law enforcement officials, but the FBI is involved in a ton of corrupt shit as well. But, a lot of them will never be held accountable for it since they are the ones in control of the federal law enforcement pretty much. And that's something that we need to you need to remember. Personally, I think the libertarian position is, to abolish the FBI, abolish all state law enforcement. Law enforcement, like everything else, is best handled by the private sector rather than the public sector. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then next we have Communism and Individualism from Enrico Malatesta. That's supposed from Narco Federation. That looks like a huge wall of text that I'm not going to bother reading. But yeah, I personally think communism is very anti-individualistic, I would say. This guy might be arguing the opposite, and I guess you can make that argument, I guess. But personally, I think communism is very much forced collectivism, especially in practice. It might sound good in theory, but in practice you get tyrants like Stalin and Mao, and that's very important to remember as well. I think if people want to have voluntary communist communes where everyone involved consents, I think that's fine. But personally, I don't think people should be forced into communism without consenting to it, and that's pretty much communism whenever it's implemented is going to result in that, and it's going to fail just like every other time in history it's failed when it's been implemented. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Josiah Warren, the Practical Anarchist, posted by Narco Federation, and that's the video on YouTube. Josiah Warren, the Practical Anarchist, posted by Crispin Sartwell, and they added, the continuity with Goodwin is provided by Robert Owen and the astonishing Francis Fanny Wright. Warren, 1798 to 1874, held the first American anarchist and libertarian, was the founder of American individualist anarchism. But let's talk about the meaning of individualism and collectivism. And yeah, personally, I do think, a lot of people get all way too caught up in ideology when it comes to individualism. Individualism isn't something that's not necessarily anarchic or libertarian or liberal or conservative or progressive or whatever ideology you want to spit out. Individualism is whatever I think people want to make of it. Each individual should be able to have their own take on individualism without tying it to specific ideology. These days I think people care more about their ideologies than actual lifestyles. And I think the libertarian position is, if you want to care all about your ideology and think it's the greatest thing ever, that's fine. But you shouldn't be forcing your definition of the ideology on other people. You can talk about it, but a lot of people might disagree, and that's okay. That's very much the libertarian position. Everyone can have their own opinions. You don't need to agree that. Yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Dave Smith loves that neocons are freaking out about Tucker's interview with Nick. Fuck you. You guys don't get to control the conversation anymore. Posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross post from the Libertarian meme subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think Reddit and a lot of a lot of the more establishment conservatives are freaking out that Nick Fuentes got platform as big as Tucker Carlson. But I agree with Dave Smith's take here. You guys don't get to control the conversation anymore. Nick Fuentes is kind of an autistic edgelord chud, but that's a lot of young people these days. And if Tucker wants to interview him, I think he should be able to. Just because you disagree with him doesn't mean you can have him censored. But of course, Reddit, if it were up to them, everyone who they disagreed with would be permanently censored, like Charlie Kirk. They'd be dead and buried in a pine box somewhere. And it just goes to show you that people say, oh, we need to gatekeep certain opinions. Well, in reality, no opinions are gatekept, should be gatekept in the age of social media. Social media should be maximum free speech. And even if you don't really care for Nick Fuentes, you need to support his right to free speech, even if you don't like what he's saying. But of course, Reddit, if it were up to Reddit, he'd probably be buried right next to Charlie Kirk, and then Reddit would kill anyone who dissented at all from any of their narratives, and that's why you're seeing people like Nick Fuentes rise, who are kind of edgy, but they killed the more moderate Charlie Kirk. This is the punishment that you get as a result. When you kill Charlie Kirk, you're gonna get a more radical and extreme version of him to replace him, and this is a good example. And this is a good example as to why. Next, we have famous president's quotes posted by Donald Key, and that's a meme of Donald Trump. We took the freedom of speech away, Donald Trump, and it looks like he's a picture of him grinning or something. And yeah, personally, I don't think Donald Trump cares for freedom of speech, but a lot of the Democrats are hypocritical because, they've been yelling, oh, we gotta censor hate speech and misinformation for years, but then Donald Trump comes in power, and they suddenly say, oh, we're for the party of free speech. You're not the party of free speech. You're only for free speech because your side's out of power. You're going to become anti-free speech the second you get power back again. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have someone learned some new words like rue and extortionist and filibuster, and that's a post from Ragnarok HD, and it's a screenshot of a true from Donald Trump. Remember, Republicans, regardless of the Schumer shutdown, the Democrats will terminate the filibuster the first chance they get. They will pack the Supreme Court, pick up 2 states, and at least 8 electoral votes. Their 2 objectives are gone. Don't be weak and stupid. Fight, win. We will immediately end the extortionist shutdown, get all of our agenda passed, and make life so good for Americans that these deranged Democrat politicians will never again have the chance to destroy America. Republicans, you will rue the day that you didn't terminate the filibuster. Be tough, be smart, and win. This is much bigger than the shutdown. This is the survival of our country. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should get rid of the filibuster, but the Democrat, when the Democrats were in power, Reddit wanted them to get rid of the filibuster because they thought their side would never lose power again. I like the filibuster because it can stall legislation, and I think the less legislation that Congress gets out there, the better. Ideally, there'd be no legislation from Congress just like there'd be no executive orders from the president and no rulings by the Supreme Court. All government rulings and legislation and orders and all that I would say, are innately authoritarian. People should make their own legislation and orders and all that rather than follow whatever the government says to do. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Whiny Crybully declares it's illegal to mock him from the dailybeast.com, posted by CH4Locks. And that's the article. Trump 79 claims it's illegal for late night hosts to mock him. And yeah, personally, I think Trump, he should just ignore late night TV hosts rather than constantly perseverate on them. But he's a boomer. That's what he thinks people still care about, even though no one really cares about late night anymore. It's pretty much just political propaganda like cable news, and that's why increasingly no one's tuning in. I think if Trump were smart, he'd be going more after places like Reddit or TikTok. Those are places where, where the narrative is made these days, that and other social media. But, Trump, he's still a boomer. He thinks people are still watching TV, when in reality, only people his age are the ones who are really watching the TV. Everyone else has moved on to streaming, social media, and the internet. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have How Can a Militant Labor Movement Grow from the znetwork.org, posted by Gora M. Person 777. And yeah, personally, it's the actual article is How Can Syndicalism Grow? Notes from Sweden. And yeah, personally, I think if people want to do a voluntary syndicalist government, I think they should be able to, but I don't think anyone should be forced to get into it if they don't want to. I think the libertarian perspective is, voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. If you want to have, you and a bunch of friends want to live on like a compound together and have like a fascist compound or a communist compound or a socialist compound or a syndicalist compound or whatever ideology you want, you do you, but don't force that stuff on me, especially if I don't consent to it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have U.S. carries out new strike in Caribbean, killing 3 alleged drug smugglers from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the NPR subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but as I said, the government can justify bombing whoever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they have the legal monopoly on the use of force. Also, I think it's funny that, he's citing NPR here, which is also a government-run news source, but, it's interesting. It's interesting because it's like they say, "Oh, I'm anti-government," but here's a government-run news source, and it just goes to show you that people hate the government until it pushes out narratives they like. NPR, since they're seen as anti-Trump, even though Trump's technically their boss, Reddit loves them. And it just goes to show you, Reddit loves the government whenever it pushes the narratives that it likes or whatever, and that's why they really probably the biggest reasons they hate Trump is he takes away their ability to control the government fully, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Hexif bars military officials from discussing drug vote strikes with Congress without prior approval from CNN.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think that goes against freedom of speech, but that when you're working for someone, they can make whatever rules they want to, and I personally don't really care for this rule, but he has every right to make it. Next we have Republican Propaganda Fantasies, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the Conservative Terrorism subreddit. Jesse Waters spreading lies on Fox justify Trump invoking the Insurrection Act, and that looks like a blue sky post from Glenn Klippenstein. Fox News, Antifa took their anarchist cookbooks and gas masks up the street to a new safe house, but the feds are on their tails. We just arrested all Portland Antifa lieutenant. And yeah, personally I don't really care for that. Antifa, they shouldn't be agitating federal worker agents, I would say. It's interesting where it says, oh, this is literally Nazi Germany, but they purposely go out of their way to agitate them as much as possible. And I think the libertarian position is, if you want to do that, that's fine. But personally, I would just try and leave them alone and not get into trouble. But if you want to get into trouble, that's on you. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Billionaires Want You to Think Liberalism is as far left as you can go. Real leftism is a threat to billionaires' power. Posted by Sean Panky Dan. That's crosspost from the Work Reform subreddit. And that's a tweet from Kim from Kansas, who tweeted, Capitalists would likely believe that liberalism is the leftmost edge of the economic spectrum, precisely because it's the leftmost part of the spectrum that doesn't threaten their power. The true leftism threatens the power of capitalists. Liberalism is not leftism. And I guess I would kind of agree with that, ultimately I think, the socialism, communism, anything left of liberalism is just authoritarianism in a different costume. Just because it's not the authoritarianism that we have today, even though in some aspects I would say the government is the U.S. government currently is kind of neo-socialist or neo-communist. Just because it's not the authoritarians we have in government today doesn't make them not authoritarian. Just because your ideology isn't in power doesn't mean it's not authoritarian. And that's very much how Reddit, Reddit thinks, they think, oh, my ideology is good because it's not in power, therefore, it's not responsible for all this. But, just because that's true doesn't make your ideologies any good. If it were up to me, I'd rather live in North Korea than in a country run by average Redditor, because at least in North Korea they don't make any they don't have any bullshit pretext about how I guess they do think their system is probably the most correct one in the world, but at the very least they're very openly authoritarian and militaristic. Reddit would be, they'd be very militaristic and authoritarian as well, but they try and convince you that they're all about freedom. Well, in reality, they're some of the most freedom-hating people around. They only like freedom when it applies to groups they like brown migrants or the LGBTQ, whatever other letters they've added as well, people. And let's see if there's anything new. So nothing new. And I'd like to also share a post I made in the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, is the United States salvageable from a libertarian perspective? I personally would argue for no. I think that there is a lot of hope in the libertarian circles that a relatively libertarian politician like Thomas Massey could get elected POTUS and fix everything, but I personally think the system is too corrupted to fix at this point, and that the president is mostly just a figure of political practical power if the real people running the country are the unelected bureaucrats such as the military-industrial complex, special interest groups like IPAC and big business, and malversed agencies like the FBI, CIA, etc. I think that the best course of action at this point would be to dissolve the union and have the states go their separate ways. This doesn't say that state and local governments are still not going to be authoritarian. In my ideal system, we don't have any forced collectivism at all, but at the very least, it would reduce the neo-imperialism of the American empire by ending its status as world power. It's sad because I love the experiment the founding fathers set out to create, but it's a lot like O.D. Eller when they have to kill the dog at the end to put it out of its misery, And I think that's very much where the U.S. is at right now. The U.S. needs to realize that, people aren't happy. They need to change the status quo, and we keep voting for politicians that are supposed to change the status quo. Like Barack Obama's whole thing was, we're going to change, and he didn't really change the status quo. Then Donald Trump's whole thing was, we're going to shake things up, and he didn't really change the status quo either. Eventually, I think it's just time to call it a career and just disband the country. I think, it's kind of an extreme measure, but at this point, I really don't think there's too much else you can really do to solve the U.S.'s problems right now, especially since it's been arguably since the Second World War, and that was decades ago. And yeah, personally, I think you got it's something at least worth considering. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.